Hello,
Yay.
Extempers, speech and debaters, and everybody else listening to this podcast. Today, we have a special episode for you if you want to get away from a lot of Ukrainian news. Today, we're actually going to focus on Biden's Supreme Court nomination to replace Justice Breyer. Yeah. Oh, this is not like saying like, yeah, we're going to replace Breyer. This is saying like, yeah, I'm so excited for this episode. So on that note, I'm YuYu.
And I'm Adrian.
And this is the half hour. Welcome back. Just a couple of things before we actually start this week's episode. We do want to recognize that the prediction that we made about Russia and Ukraine on the first episode that we did about Russia-Ukraine was false. Russia did actually end up invading, and it's not that it's not in Russia's interest to invade. There probably was a lot of factors that, came into their decision to invade into Ukraine and cause all of this destruction that we are now seeing on the news. But that being said, things can always be missed, especially like by analysts. But what we can do now is to be aware of the situation that is going on, make sure that the news that we're reading is not fake in any way, shape, or form. It's from a credible news source. It has credible evidence to back up its points and also show support for Ukrainian citizens that are now suffering from a lot of pain. So yeah, that little acknowledgement. Second acknowledgement that I want to make is I know last week's episode, Spencer was in the episode, but just a reminder that was pre-recorded. Spencer is still off in La La Land doing his own thing. So you're stuck with Adrian and I. So
Sucks to be you, I guess.
I don't think it does. But anyway, yeah, maybe Adrian actually just replaces Spencer for good. Like I actually fired Spencer. Just kidding. We love Spencer. He'll be back in like 2 weeks. But as state approaches, because this episode will be released the week of state, I hope that you will enjoy this episode about Supreme Court Justice nominee Kentaji Brown Jackson. So I'm going to pass it off to Adrian to start us off with this whole SCOTUS situation.
Coolio. Well, I think this topic is like especially interesting just because it comes at like such a wacky time with like the Ukraine crisis, because it means that like while not a lot of legislation is going to come through because we're like really focused on like making sure that Ukraine like has materials that they need, etc. This is like one political issue that will like probably be like very prominent in the US for like at least a short time, and at least while the like stuff in Ukraine is going on. So if you're thinking about like what's going to be like an important thing if you have a domestic topic, this is probably going to be issue number one, because I don't think anything else like legislation wise is going to be like squeezing its way out anytime soon. So before we like talk about like the important things that Kentaji Brown Jackson could do, and a lot of the important stuff that's going on with her, I think it's important that we like establish a background. And for starters, to talk about like how we got into the situation where we're nominating her in the first place, because we're, as you mentioned before, we're replacing Breyer, but that is a half good thing, maybe half bad thing. We don't know yet. So for starters, Breyer is an old man, a dinosaur now. He's reaching the age of 83. And that means it's about time for him to consider retiring. And in fact, a lot of like far left-leaning people have been asking him to retire for quite some time now, because they were really worried that under like a brand new like Republican controlled presidency, that they could appoint their nominees instead of getting somebody more liberal on the courts, especially when we're already stuck in this like permanent 6-3 limbo for as far as like the foreseeable future has. And right now we're sitting at 3 liberals and 6 conservative judges, and that balance isn't going to change with the replacement of Kentaji Brown Jackson. It's just going to go from 6-3 back to 6-3, hopefully, as long as she gets like appointed. It's important to note though that at least in some capacity, Breyer had the contingency plan. He said if whatever Biden's nomination wasn't picked or didn't get through the nomination process, he would stay around for at least like another year, or hopefully not any longer, in an attempt to find like an appropriate replacement for him. So even at the end of the day, if everybody does end up hating Kentaji Brown Jackson, which I think is very unlikely, he will be staying on the court for a little bit longer. But don't keep your hopes up for that. I feel like he's probably wanted to retire and get back to his kids for as long as he can. Before we talk about Kentaji Brown as like a person, though, I also kind of want to talk about like how like the court like nomination process works, because it's also going to be an important question when you're talking about like, well, how does she get appointed? When does she get appointed? And does she get appointed? Looking back at like some history about how these nominations are done, a lot of Supreme Court nomination stuff has changed like in like the recent past. Like we've had hundreds of Supreme Court justices, but like most of the reforms to the process and how people are like actually nominated, selected, etc., have been in the last like 10 years. If you look back towards 2014, to get into like the appellate and the district courts, not the Supreme Court, completely different. There could be like a filibuster to uphold and prevent as many people from getting onto the courts as possible. This was a strategy that the Republican Party tried to do to prevent most of the Democratic nominees from getting into the appellate and district court levels. That was until Larry Reed, who was the majority leader under Obama, finally said, we're over this, we're implementing what's called the nuclear rule. Which allows them to actually go past the filibuster and allows them to actually go past even like the vote of cloture and just need to get the 50 votes necessary in the Senate and just get the majority in order for the judges to be appointed, which solved a lot of problems that were going back on in 2014. And understandably, a lot of the Republicans were very upset about this because they're like, well, now all the Democrats get to shove through their appointees and we won't get to shove through any of ours in the upcoming administration. Flash forward to 2017, in the most hilarious and ironic turn of events ever, the death of like Antonin Scalia caused Mitch McConnell to be like, wait, I have an idea. And he proposed that they should do the nuclear rule also for the Supreme Court justice picks, because he was very upset that apparently the Democrats didn't want Trump to fill up the new Gorsuch seat, which, you know, once again, the Trump administration held over from the Obama administration. Obama had the chance to replace Scalia, and appointee. The Republican Party was able to hold it off until Trump, at which point they appointed Neil Gorsuch through the implementation of the nuclear rule exclusively under the Supreme Court, now in effect. So the only thing that's a requirement for somebody to be on the Supreme Court or for them to get like that nomination is purely they have to win that majority vote in the Senate exclusively. The House has nothing to do with it. It's just exclusively whether or not the Senate votes for it, meaning that we have the current 48 Democrats, 2 independents, and 50 Republicans voting to see whether or not Kentaji Brown Jackson would belong on the court. And once again, jump forward to 2022, nothing has changed since that nuclear rule has been implemented since 2017. So we'll just see if she can get those votes that she needs. Speaking of which, let's actually talk about her, because I think she has a lot of background that makes her a very like interesting candidate for the job. Number one, she's 51 years old, making her the second youngest inductee, right behind ACB on the courts right now. And hopefully that means that her impact on the court will be long standing and that she'll be there for a long time to sort of like block any more like 6-3 majority rules of any like political party for quite some time, and she'll hopefully like cement her spot in there for a good like 20-30 years. The second, and probably should have been first and definitely most obvious thing, is that she's the first Black woman to be nominated to the Supreme Court, which is like a huge stride for like many reasons. One thing that's important to note though is that she's not like the first woman of color to be appointed to the Supreme Court. That was Sonia Sotomayor. So don't go saying that in your speeches. First Black woman, which is still an important milestone. It's just, you know, it's not everything. It's this one little niche thing. Some other fun things that she has going on. She has family ties with Paul Ryan because her brother's brother is brothers-in-law with Senator Ryan, which means that he has actively come out on Twitter and actively out in front of a lot of people and said that we absolutely support her in whatever, meaning that that 50 vote gap is like much closer than you might think. And lastly, for like talking about like her background, it's important to notice her like education, her experience with like the law. For starters, she graduated Harvard Law School, which is a hilariously funny sticking point for many conservatives who either have one opinion that she's like the most intelligent person and maybe could be put on the court if she like proved herself, or secondarily that she's super elitist for bragging about going to Harvard and should feel bad for it. Therefore, they will not put her on the Supreme Court, which are two very funny like dichotomies that exist. Second, she also clerked for 3 federal jurists, including Breyer, of whom she's obviously like replacing. She was chosen for this position by Biden as well, meaning that she's probably been like the secret choice from Biden, like ever since day one, and like back in early March when they first appointed her to like the appellate court. And also, most importantly, she's a public defender, which means that she's going to be the first public defender nominated to the court since Thurgood Marshall, which means that there's been a 30-year gap between the last person who did like actual lawyering and not just defending like big oil or reading the Constitution a bunch. And she's a lot more in tune with things like immigration law, things like how minority populations are affected by laws and decisions that affect like a lot more people than probably like all of her like white judge cohort friends are aware of. But lastly, I think it's important to realize like how she got into this position. It's not just like graduating from Harvard Law School like makes you the perfect candidate. It's a lot of like culminating factors. For starters, Obama actually appointed her to being the district judge back in 2013. And interestingly, he also interviewed her for the position of being the new Supreme Court nomination back to replace Scalia, although she wasn't like the final person that was chosen by the Obama administration. It does mean that she has been a potential candidate for this job for the last 9 years, which I think is kind of funny. Second is that Biden actually nominated her for like the U.S. Court of Appeals in March of last year, which we kind of already talked about, but it means that she was already approved by all 50 Democrats, and also that includes people like Manchin and like Sinema, and also surprisingly 3 Republican senators, which I assume you will touch up on a little bit later, and like the impact and whether or not she'll be appointed. And lastly, I think it's important to realize that she's like moderately leaning. She's not like necessarily the most liberal person that's ever existed, and that's like a huge step for like the Supreme Court nominations, because right now it sort of seems like they're just trying to be as like on one side as possible, so that way you can like solidify your spot in the courts for as long as possible. But typically the Democratic Party has been like nominating like left but kind of moderate people for quite some time. Like even RBG, when she was first put on the court, was like flat out deemed like mostly liberal but technically moderate, which is like kind of an interesting spin on a lot of things that are happening right now. And I think it's important to note that this will certainly make her like nomination process a lot easier, and actually helps her get like nominated to the court. And I think all this like information combined makes her like a very interesting pick for the Biden administration, and maybe just trying to like pick this moderate candidate and trying to be like a little bit more tame than a lot of like the Republican picks like ACB, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh will sort of just like calm things down in the Supreme Court for hopefully a little bit. And while like I'm down to talk about her past all day, I think maybe it's time to give you a chance to talk about her future.
Yeah, so I guess like not much about her future is like my part, but more so about like what's been going on, like what's the gossip in the back of the room behind closed doors? What do people think about her becoming the nominee, and like what this necessarily means for her appointment, and a little bit about what this means for the future of the Supreme Court. I will agree with Adrian that she is a very super interesting pick, but I also think like just power moves, just because of like everything that she's been able to accomplish and everything that like she's been able to do to set her up for this position and to like come into this position. But that being said, we also have to talk about how things might not be as smooth sailing as everyone might think. And I'm just saying that just to be clear that like, no, it's not that she's just gonna like immediately pass through like nominees and like Senate hearing really easily and just like become the Supreme Court. Like she obviously has to do a lot of things in terms of talking to certain Republican senators so that she can ensure that she is accepted as a justice. So many sources say that she'll be seated on the Supreme Court, no problem. Some sources say it will stall. Overall, I think that Judge Jackson will still be seated on the Supreme Court in place of Justice Breyer when he retires, but the ones who are critical about her nomination have some very interesting takes, as we've kind of like saw the glimpse of that in Adrian's background. And I think some of these reasons about why they are critical also draws on last week's episode about polarization and like the conversation we had surrounding the Supreme Court question. But what I'm mainly getting at is that Senate Republicans are not entirely happy with the choice and are mainly concerned with what it means for Republicans politically. Like we mentioned last episode, just to be clear, the Supreme Court does not create laws. They just decide the constitutionality of laws. This still poses some challenges to Republicans implementing laws in their own state that might be deemed as unconstitutional if they were to be appealed to the Supreme Court. But while the appointment doesn't really change the split in the Supreme Court because Jackson would be replacing Breyer, who is a liberal-leaning justice, some Republicans are still going to show dissatisfaction to maintain their position and kind of public stance, kind of like a guarantee to their constituents that they're not just like, oh, it's fine, liberal-leaning justice, whatever, they still have to show some sort of agreements with their constituents. And this is just like their way of doing that. So for example, Senator Lindsey Graham has said that this move was an indication that the radical left has won over Biden again, and others have criticized Jackson's history with being a public defender and her ruling in the federal appellate courts. Another thing that Graham has brought up about Jackson's nomination is that she would be another Supreme Court justice that is a part of the Harvard to Yale to Supreme Court justice pipeline. By the way, it's not really like a pipeline, but it should be noted that the majority of Supreme Court justices did go to institutions like Yale and Harvard to get their law degrees and to get their education. So in response to this, Lindsey Graham actually vouched for J. Michelle Childs of South Carolina to be the justice that went to Duke, and she would be a potential Supreme Court justice that would like break this Yale to Harvard to Supreme Court justice pipeline. But I do think this is all very interesting because Lindsey Graham was one of those people that did, approve Judge Jackson's position in the DC appellate court. So it's really interesting how he's not willingly saying that he will then approve the vote to her becoming a justice. Mitch McConnell has also made his concerns clear, making statements like how she's a part of the far left's agenda to dismantle the Supreme Court system, which is a very, very loaded statement. But other than that, Senator Josh Hawley has also made remarks about her decisions when it came to crime and justice. Again, very broad statements that still has a lot of negative tones and negative elements in terms of just critiquing her as a nomination or as a justice if she were to become a justice. Clarification, Mitch McConnell did not vote for her to be on the DC appellate court, but whether or not he will vote for her to become a justice is to be seen. So not all Republican senators are outwardly denying their support for Jackson, but their support is questionable as we can't confirm whether they will or won't. Jackson will meet with many of them to have conversations about her nomination and her credibility as a justice. So she's set to meet with Senator Mitch McConnell. That actually took place Tuesday of this week that we are recording. Susan Collins, Chuck Grassley, and more in just this coming week, or not this coming week, but just this week. And she's already met with Mitch McConnell, like I've said, but again, there's no confirmation on what their conversation ended with and if there is a set decision of yes from Mitch McConnell. It is likely that Senator Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who did vote for her to be on the DC appellate court, will vote for her to become a justice. But Senator Collins has come out and said that she is not sure yet of her decision, but she will definitely have conversations with Judge Jackson. But overall, Jackson should be able to become a Supreme Court justice eventually, as there's not really any dissent among the Democratic Party senators in terms of just whether to vote for her or not. They all pretty much agree that they will vote for her to become a justice and approve her. Besides Senate Republicans, she has also been called into question from right-leaning citizens of the United States. For example, Tucker Carlson has questioned her education and qualifications because of her race. He was doing things like demanding for her LSAT scores and questioning whether she was relatable to the public or not. If you've been keeping up with the news about Supreme Court justices, you will also hear the argument that the Black population only accounts for 6% of the United States population, and that's unfair because it seems to exclude everybody else and of who was also just as capable. But then again, that is why people are very mad about the fact that Tucker Carlson has made these remarks, because it's kind of indicating that Black people don't have the same or aren't as capable as white people, which is very racist and something that a lot of people had issue with and people brought up. But other Republicans have questioned her political stance and influence that she would have in the Supreme Court. So Carrie Severino, who is the president of the Judicial Crisis Network, has made claims that Judge Jackson will just be a politician in robes, which again is a very bold claim that is not likely to be true. Like I said before, the Supreme Court doesn't make laws, it just makes decisions on the constitutionality of laws. But why is this necessarily happening? Why is there so much controversy surrounding the situation where it seems like she is a very credible person? She went to Yale, she went to Harvard, she is a judge for the DC Appellate Court. You don't just get there out of luck, right? You get there through certain steps, certain procedures, and that requires a lot in terms of credibility and credentials and qualifications. So the answer to that question would be both news sources and academia asserts that her credibility and credentials have been put into question because she is a woman and a person of color. Political scientists Christina Boyd and Paul Collins Jr., along with law professor Ringhand, found that women who were nominated, especially if they were a person of color, got more remarks about their qualifications, knowledge, and credentials than compared to other nominations that were fairly white or male. And you can see this in terms of how Sonia Sotomayor got her position as a justice, because in the Senate hearing, she got a lot of questions, again, about her credibility, her qualifications. And that was because around that time, there was still racist sentiments going about and also sexist sentiments going about because she was a woman and she was also of Latinx origin. And that was something that a lot of people brought up in terms of how that affected her qualifications. And so this is just something to keep note of, that these research studies, these data studies have also found that women were twice as likely to be interrupted by the opposing party when they were in Senate hearings. Again, just reiterating the fact that these institutions, they tend to reinforce very stereotypical and racist sentiments, and that will be seen in terms of Senate hearings and stuff like that, just as we've seen historically. Overall, though, the majority of the claims by Republican senators and citizens are not well substantiated. In fact, according to most, she's very similar to Breyer and the decisions that he has made during his time as a Supreme Court justice, because the fact that she has worked under him and has close relations in terms of in a professional setting means that she knows his whole process and how everything is going to go with that. So most likely things will not become more left or radical when Kentaji is appointed, like Adrian said. And so that being said, it also brings up the question of what does this do in terms of for the future, precedent setting? Why is this so important, and why are many people recognizing this? And the answer is just it makes history, very stereotypically, it makes history just because of the fact that she would be the first Black female Supreme Court justice that has a background in the criminal justice system, that was a public defender, that is personally associated with how the criminal justice system operates, familial wise and professional setting wise. And what will be interesting and what she brings to the Supreme Court is a potential reframing of certain issues in terms of how court opinions are written or decided. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it is doing what Biden has set out to do, which is to introduce more perspectives and experiences within the Supreme Court so that, as a society and as America's progression, we are progressing towards a place that includes more diverse experiences and perspectives. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad decision. I think she's going to be appointed. So, I mean, we've been wrong before, but in this scenario, I think it would be very, very odd if she was not appointed as a Supreme Court justice. So yeah, I mean, we are two freshmen in college making very bold claims about politics and analytics and stuff like that. But I don't know. I don't know what you think, Adrian, but
Yeah, I remember last year giving a speech on whether or not I thought Amy Coney Barrett might vote in favor or against abortion, and I'm taking back all those claims right now because I was a little too forgiving.
yeah.
That the nomination phase can be a questionable one. I guess we'll just hope for the best.
But yeah, that jumps us right into the questions for today from Extemp Central. The first one that we're going to discuss is how forcefully should Republicans push back against President Biden's Supreme Court pick? What do you think, Adrian?
Well, I really hope you're not forced to answer this question because it sounds terrible. I think like they shouldn't push too hard against her. In fact, probably like not much at all. Like I don't think they have like much to like uphold in terms of like Republican solidarity, considering like the last like year they've just been like together block voting against as much legislation as possible. And I feel like this like Supreme Court pick just like isn't worth their time. Like as I talked about before, like she's pretty moderate, all things considered. So they don't like have like a real reason to go against her outside of just like, well, we don't really know what she does, or like we don't really know like what she's been, which is like a blatant lie because they did vote for her to go on like the appellate court. And like even then, like 3 Republican senators were like, yeah, I mean, like she seems like a perfectly qualified individual. How could you not choose her? And I feel like at the end of the day, like she's not as bad as like I think the Republican Party was like thinking that the choice could have been. And I think that certainly helps their case as like a reason why they shouldn't necessarily push back as much as they might otherwise. I think the second and probably like most obvious reason is that like it's only gonna hurt them. Like as much as we talked about like how like unfortunate it is that like Kentaji Brown Jackson is like a woman of color, and like she gets a lot of questions about like her qualifications just because she's a woman or just because she's like black, and like did you look through all the applicants, you like really know she's the most qualified person. I feel like the imminent second that most of these like senators come out and say like, well, I just don't think she's qualified because she's black and a woman, it doesn't help their political careers, which like, you know, maybe that speaks to like some part of their base, but like with midterms coming up, like I don't really know like how much of that like hardline stance on like we know if this person is educated is like really gonna like push you forward to like making your own communities like you more. And I feel like you can already see that with people like Lindsey Graham and like Murkowski, et cetera, Collins. Like they're all like, yeah, like at the end of the day, like we're like okay to admit like we don't really want our political careers to just be ultimately tanked by like opposing this person. So I think that like, you know, if it only like serves to hurt them in the future, it's probably not the best choice. And last but not least, like as we talked about before, like it's not going to change the court makeup. Like it's still going to be like a 6-3 conservative majority. Like Trump just got through like Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, ACB. Like how much more control were you really hoping to have over the Supreme Court when like the Supreme Court shouldn't be changing like more than one justice like every couple of presidents, let alone 3 in like one president's term. And I think that just sort of like contextualizing it as that is like they've already had so many Republican wins. Like I don't really see like how Kentaji is going to make like a massive change to the court decisions, especially since like Breyer was already so like far like left leaning that like it's not going to do much, or if anything, it just sort of like solidifies the Republican control. Like Breyer made decisions on things like capital punishment. He was like the forerunner of like civil rights issues. Like he was like pretty far left, and like if Kentaji is like moderate as like whether like the media or as many like of like Biden's constituents want to like hold her up to be, then like that's only a win for like the Republican Party. And I feel like just fighting tooth and nail to not get her appointed can only hurt. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I like fully agree with all the analysis that you're doing. I think like you put it out pretty clearly. But to explore the other side of this and to like actually give an answer of how forcefully they should push, the idea of midterms that you brought up is something to consider. If you were to say like they should at least push against it a little bit, would be like the fact that midterms are coming up. Most Republican senators are concerned that if they have this appointment like done in like by April, which is the goal for Democrats, then it could mean like another win before midterms come around. And that would be bad in terms of like how Republicans are faring, what they're doing, and like reflecting off of like how they've been able to kind of combat this whole situation where Biden is the president, another Supreme Court justice has been like appointed. Biden's like decision and whole outlook and like how he's been treating everything and stuff like that to Republican senators, it is just another win for the Democrats if Kentaji was to be appointed by April. Now, that being said, again, you don't have to like fully just forcefully say, no, I'm not going to vote for you, right? In order to say that like, hey, my stance is that I don't know, like that to me feels like enough to just push back a little bit so that you have appeal to your voter base and show them that like, hey, you know what, I'm not just like exactly just letting this fly through without just saying like I'm letting this fly through, because at least having some pushback shows your voter base that they like you're listening to them and things like that. So in terms of how forcefully they should push back, I think at the moment, the way that they're like pushing back in terms of like taking a stance and like, I don't know, like questioning her credibility and credentials, even though it's a very sad thing that they have to do, and I don't think it's like necessary, is something that they have to do to appeal to their voter base in terms of like, how do we get more votes and ensure our seats by midterms, And so there's that. Do I agree with this? No, I think it's kind of ridiculous, some of the claims that have been made in terms of just like the evidence, the facts, they're clear cut, like they're there. She's very intelligent. She's obviously very capable. She has the credentials to back up her, position as a Supreme Court justice, just because of like what she's been doing, what she's done, and the fact that she is a public defender, or she was a public defender, should not factor into how these decisions are made for these judges, especially when the majority of like cases that are coming to the Supreme Court deal with race, deal with crime, deal with the criminal justice system and things like that. Having a new perspective there is to ensure that like in the future, if things go awry and if something like very heinous that gets passed and like infringes on all of our rights, at least we have justices there that can write dissenting opinions that other people can use to argue for that case and argue against those infringements on our rights. And so, yeah, I think she offers a lot to the table, and I don't really know or understand why Republicans are pushing so hard against it. But again, listen to the polarization episode. I'm sure you'll get a lot more in-depth explanation about that there. So check that out. But yeah, if Adrian doesn't have anything else to add, we can move on to the second question.
I got nothing else to say.
Okay. So the second question is, if confirmed, how would Justice Kentaji Brown Jackson affect the dynamics of the Supreme Court? I think I can go like first this time, but like we've been saying, it doesn't really change the dynamics of the Supreme Court per se, because it is still a 6-3 split. She's not replacing a conservative-leaning justice. She's replacing Breyer, who is a liberal-leaning justice, meaning there is no change in the way that the Supreme Court has been split. But if you have already listened to last week's episode about polarization, where we also encountered this question about the Supreme Court, you will also know that like even if the split is 6-3, that doesn't necessarily mean that the votes on certain bills are 6-3. Most of them, they get down to like a 5-4 vote, where like conservative leaning justices are voting against things that they feel infringe on rights and is unconstitutional, even though they were like bills or things that like the Republican senators have like made into law, or like they're looking at cases in which you would think they would lean more conservative and like vote conservative, but they haven't, because they're evaluating the constitutionality of the law rather than like taking in their political stance and then implementing it there. So with Kentaji Brown Jackson in the Supreme Court justice, I don't think it necessarily affects the dynamics. One of the articles that I was reading for this episode also mentioned the fact that like if she's appointed into the Supreme Court justice, any kind of like new thing or like new improvements in social justice or things like that will not come into fruition immediately. It will come into fruition years down the line, maybe like 20 or so years down the line, when one of her dissenting opinions has been taken into consideration there. But in the immediate aspect of like changing the dynamic, it's not really going to like change anything. It's just going to stay the way that it has stayed.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of like our responses to like the other question also sort of apply here. Just sort of like, I genuinely think that like her portrayal as like this more moderate candidate, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, maybe it's all hype to make Republicans be like, I saw this one article that says she's moderate, I'm totally down for that, I buy it. And at the end of the day, if it could be true that she's more moderate, then people like Breyer and her decisions like aren't all exactly the same, like that's like only a win for like the Republican Party. So I don't think like if you do want to take the route that like the dynamics will change, I think it's like yes, but like in a bad way for the liberals, because like they had a good thing going and then they kind of just like threw it away. Like they could have probably got somebody a lot more like left leaning on the courts. For example, like you have people like Senator Manchin, who we presume to be like the number one. If there's going to be a stoppage, he's probably going to be the one that does it. Like even he came out and said like, I am totes cool voting for somebody like more liberal than I am, like almost like direct quote, which is like a huge statement from him, considering he just shut down like trillions of dollars of money to like infrastructure and climate change stuff. But like him saying that he's like, I'm down for like more liberal interpretations of the Constitution is like a huge step and like a monumental statement for him, which maybe it's just like I don't really want to get involved. I don't want to end up where all the Republican senators are going to get like thrown down the like, we hate you rabbit like trail. So we're just going to stick with our like, you're cool, do whatever you want opinion. And maybe that's because he already knew it was going to be Kentaji Jackson and felt like pretty comfortable just like saying that like, yeah, I'm down with supporting her specifically. Or maybe it's a sign that like the Democrats had a lot more influence than that they like really realized. And they could have just thrown it like all away on like this like more moderate person that isn't going to do a lot to like maintain their majority lead. Like I would not be surprised if you got down to like some 7-2 splits in the upcoming future about like some more like slightly conservative issues. And that could, it won't change the dynamics at the end of the day because it's still a like massive conservative like leaning like court, but it could call into question whether or not like the liberal or / democratic like side of the court can ever make a comeback. And yeah, I feel like we may have just exhausted this question. It doesn't seem particularly substantive as is.
I don't know. I think for this question, you definitely have to give an answer of like how it affects the dynamics. And I guess the best answer that you could give is just like it doesn't affect the dynamics immediately. Like we need to kind of gather what happens, but we can always make predictions about like what's going to happen in the future, what she has been voting on, and kind of like the opinions pieces that she's been writing in terms of making decisions could, you know, be used in the future to make certain decisions about other things. So yeah, I'm excited to see what happens. Do I think it'll change anything? Probably not, but I'm still excited to see what happens. I'm excited for Kentaji Brown Jackson to become a Supreme Court justice. Anyway, it really changes our Supreme Court justice test that we did in high school, Adrian. Like, oh my God.
Can you still do it now?
All 9. I don't know.
All right, you're on the spot. Go for it.
Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Alito, Breyer, maybe Jackson now, Barrett, Sotomayor, No. Oh, that makes me so sad. Oh, okay. Oh, shoot. I don't even remember.
Thomas.
Yeah, I was gonna say Thomas, but I'm like, there's another G.
Roberts.
There's another G Justice.
You got Gorsuch, right?
Yeah, but there's another one.
Oh.
Yeah. Like I wasn't gonna move on until I got her.
Oh no, this isn't good.
Oh no. I'm so
I'm not
sorry.
looking it up. We failed you. No.
I looked it up the other day.
Kagan. Oh jeez, it's Kagan.
Kagan. Oh, I mean K, not G. Not G. K.
Yeah, you messed me up there. I totally knew it was Kagan. You said G and that threw me off. That's my excuse. I knew him. I knew them all. That was your fault.
Sorry. Okay.
Yep. Hashtag blame YuYu. If you don't remember your 9 Supreme Court justices, it's all her fault. You knew it was Kagan. She thought it started with
What's the G in Kagan? Okay. Anyway.
fair.
For funsies, if you know all 9 Supreme Court justices, especially the one that is going to be replaced, let us know in the comments down below. No cheating.
Especially from what we just did right now. You can't use that.
No. But yeah. I think this is a good place to conclude. Obviously, Adrian and I cannot speak on this issue because we don't even know all 9 justices. But in research, we are debaters. We did Extemp. We're condensing information for you.
We know how to help you fake it till you make it.
Yeah. With that being said, I hope that you get the one in the round. If you don't get the one in the round, let us know how you did. Let us know how we did. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM either me, you don't have an Instagram, Spencer, or message/email Adrian. I'm sure we will have his email link somewhere on the video. But yeah, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, what are you doing? Hit the subscribe button and also ring the bell so you don't miss early access videos, because we post our videos and this content a day early on our YouTube channel. So make sure to give it a listen there. Ring the bell so you don't miss these episodes. I've already said that. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode. Thank you so much for your support and all of your love. Please have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest of your weekend. And for those of you competing at state, breathe. Namaste.
You got this.
Yeah. Bye.